today I have the pleasure to introduce you Laurence Bloom. He is a professional strength condition coach, and Laurence will talk about the application of strength training in football. Thank you very much, Laurence.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. Thanks for the invitation to come and present this to you and to the people watching it. Like I said, a little sort of overview really regarding the application of strength training in professional football. So just a little bit of an overview on my background to start with. So I'm currently head of performance at Millwall Football Club, position which I've sort of held for the last five seasons now. So essentially my main sort of roles and responsibilities are just to oversee the physical conditioning program of the squad, working in conjunction with the manager to try and sort of develop and implement a sort of football specific, conditioning program. Relatively sort of trying to bridge the gap as well between what the players do on the pitch and what the players do in the gym. And that's going to be the primary focus of what I'm going to talk about today. So more the gym-based S&C sort of protocols that we use within the club. And again, most of what I'm talking about is based on sort of full-time men's sort of senior level football. So obviously there's lots of different ways and methodologies that can be used at different levels, or you're working with different populations within the game. So this is mainly focused on sort of professional, full-time professional players in the Championship. Previous to my role at Millwall, I've spent 5-6 years again working in a similar role as head of sports science at Charlton Athletic. Again, mainly sort of working in League One and the Championship. And prior to that, my first sort of role in football was working with Southend United, where I started actually working within the academy. Spent 3 years working in the academy set up there, so working on sort of long-term athletic development with the younger players, and then progressed my way working again to the first team as sort of head of fitness in that position. Again, similar sort of roles and responsibilities really. So had about 15 years experience now working in professional football, delivering various sort of S&C programs along the way. And some of the things I'll probably talk about today is, what we currently do and how that's probably evolved from maybe things I used to do earlier back on my career, and sort of how that's changed within not only my philosophy, but different coaches I've worked with that have sort of evolved that process as well, and also the science and the evidence out there that's sort of come out and changed since I've been in the game. So yeah, probably quite a few changes, subtle changes along the way, but it'd be interesting to sort of explore that as we go really. So just to move it on, sorry, slides frozen there. So the first thing is, from our point of view, working in professional sport, obviously football's, quite a unique game in terms of the demands of the season and also the game. So first thing we've got to factor in is, why is resistance or strength training relevant, or why is it important for us to sort of implement that around what the players are doing on the training pitch? So for me, it's twofold really. The first main reason we do it is to try and minimise the risk of injury. So, essentially injuries are part and parcel of the game, and, it can be quite inhibitive across the season if you pick up a lot of injuries. So predominant reason we want to try and minimise that risk. So how's that achieved really is, again, I don't want this to become a physiology lesson about the sort of benefits and adaptations and principles of physiology of strength training, but, we know there's certain reasons that and benefits that strength training is going to have in terms of, increasing the tensile strength of the muscle fibers. There's been a lot of research out there, particularly in the hamstring studies that have gone on in relation to the fascicle length, the muscle fascicle length, and how that can be related to injuries. So we know that players with maybe shorter or smaller fascicles are higher risk of picking up injuries. And we know from a player point of view that each different player has a certain load capacity. So generally when a player exceeds their capacity to deal with load, that's the reason why injuries can happen. And other sort of supplementary benefits of strength training. So, we can get increased range of movement in the joints if we're training properly, improved intramuscular coordination, so firing sequences through certain exercises and methodologies that we used. And then just from like a joint sort of injury point of view, can we improve stability and proprioception through certain training methods? And often we see within football players as well that, we can have quite a lot of imbalances just because of the nature of the sport, and players can often be very sort of one side dominant as such. So, when we do our assessment protocols, what we're looking for, one of the key things we look at with the players is how symmetrical are they? So left versus right side, in terms of their limb sort of dominance, really. And what we generally look for, again, depending on a number of factors, but generally within 10% ratio between opposite limbs, so left to right side. Second main factor, we obviously implement strength training or resistance training, however we want to refer to it, is that obviously we're looking to enhance physical performance. So predominantly we're looking at minimising risk and keeping players on the pitch and available. And then secondly, it's, you know, once we get to that point and we build a capacity there for the players to stay fit and be available, then how do we look at then implementing or enhancing their performance? Again, and there's various methods and training modalities we'll use, which we'll talk about. But essentially from the physiology side of it, so we're either looking to improve their strength or their force production capabilities, or alternatively their rate of force development, so how quickly then they can produce force. And again, this is going to be partly dictated by the sort of training process and the cycle where we are in the season, but also within individual differences within the squad as well. So, you know, we do a full screening and testing battery, which I'll touch on briefly, but to try and identify, you know, which areas are going to most benefit a certain player in terms of their training prescription in the gym. Essentially, what we're looking for is whatever we're doing with them in a gym-based setting is how that then transfers to what they're doing on the pitch, or essentially how that's going to improve their performance come match day. So essentially, you know, if we're looking to either improve their force or their force production or their rate of force development, you know, what are we actually then looking to transfer that into within their performance? So a number of factors we'll look at is, you know, for example, if it's a centre half, centre defender, are we looking at improving their jump height or their jumping performance so they're, you know, more aerially dominant and winning more headers in a game, for example? It may be we're looking at, you know, for example, a striker and we need them to be a bit quicker off the mark, you know, to try and get to the ball to win an opportunity to score a goal. Then we might be looking at, you know, how do we improve their acceleration profile? Again, similarly, it might be more, rather than linear speed, it might be looking at multi-directional or change of direction efficiency. So again, when we're thinking about what exercises we're programming, you know, what planes and actors of movement are we looking at programming to what they're doing as well. And essentially another factor which we focus quite heavily on, again, it can be a little bit more positional specific. So things like your fullbacks or your wide midfielders might be more of an emphasis on that rate of force development and really being able to enhance their maximum speed over sort of longer distances. So again, you know, these factors are going to be slightly individualized based on position specific demands, based on the player's physical characteristics which they already possess, and then sort of almost putting a profile together of, you know, what the player looks like in terms of their physical performance capabilities, and also how that mirrors in with the position specific demands within the game that we're asking them to be able to perform. So like I said, you know, the aims of our programs twofold. Firstly, we want to keep them available. We want to make players more robust and keep them on the training field. You know, that's essentially, you know, what the manager's looking for. And then supplementary to that, once we have robust players that are able to perform the tasks that we want them to do and have the capacity there, then how do we then look at delving in and actually, you know, implementing strategies to enhance physical performance? So before it comes to our sort of programming and the exercise selection and prescription that we'll use, you know, we need to consider, you know, what types of strength do the players need? And again, this coming back to this will based off their individual profiles as much as a generic sort of periodization model. So essentially, you know, when we test the players, is it something that we need to improve? Is it maximal strength? So, you know, how much force, as we said, is that athlete able to produce? Now, so there's lots of research out there against certain exercises and what is optimal for a player. So, you know, the research maybe for something like a back squat, you know, is a player able to perform 1.5 to 2 times body mass on a back squat, for example, as a performance marker? And again, some of these strength testing make up our programming of obviously what we're going to implement. So we know if we strength test a player and he's only able to perform 1 times body weight on a back squat, we know that strength is going to be a particular issue for that player. If we have a player that, you know, is maybe performing 1.5 to twice body mass on a back squat, then we know maybe strength isn't the key focus of what that player is going to need to focus on within their program. So we maybe then look at into relationship with the jump testing that we're going to use, and then almost create like a bit of a force profile with a player to see, you know, what end of that spectrum on that force velocity curve that we need to be sort of targeting. So lots of these terminologies I'm just going to throw up here are used sort of interchangeably. So, you you know, from when I talked about that dynamic correspondence and what sort of strength training we're going to need to enhance performance, you know, we need to then look at when we profile the players on the pitch. So we'll use certain speed protocols. So obviously we track players now with GPS or timing gates. We'll do a profile. So we'll look at their acceleration speed. So we'll look at their 10 and 20 meter profiles of how fast they can accelerate. And also we'll take their top speed. So we'll look at a rolling 14-meter sprint test or something to gauge their overall max velocity. We can then identify for each player whether starting strength or their acceleration strength is a key factor, and how does that then correlate with the strength and power testing we're doing in the gym. Do the two correlate, for example, and that'll help us to be able to then mold the program to that individual. And again, if we look at the force velocity curve here, we'll see that, you know, as we come down the spectrum, we're going to go more from that sort of top end strength and how we sort of fit and where that fits into the season, and then working through to the bottom end of the curve where we're going to be working on that field-based, probably max speed and sort of plyometric training. So I said, like, you know, from a football player, from my perspective, you know, there's very limited opportunities to really focus on maximal strength training. And we'll take a little look at the periodization model that we sort of use across the season over the next few slides. But, you know, when we look at the force velocity curve here, it's really important that we try and focus within each individual, because I said there is a limited window of opportunity of which key areas across that curve do we need to be focusing on. So, like I said, we have all these sort of terminologies that we're going to use to describe strength or strength qualities, but it's, you know, which ones are most important for each particular player based on that speed, strength and power profiling testing that we're going to do. So they're the sort of key terminologies that I've said we use, and the key types of strength that we'll focus on within the certain points of the season, and that I said will be individual to an element. I think another key area, what I've probably changed my philosophy in, is regarding bilateral versus unilateral strength training. So probably back when I first started working in football, a lot of my prescription was based around sort of bilateral heavy strength training or bilateral lifts or derivatives of Olympic lifting. Probably what I found is that technical competence of player and sort of spinal loading restrictions have sort of become more of an issue over the years. So I feel that my programs have probably now shifted more towards probably a bit of a Mike Boyle type approach with unilateral training. I think particularly working within footballers from a technical point of view and also sort of an actual loading point of view, I found can be probably a little bit more efficient and effective way of training some of these athletes. But that's not to say that we don't incorporate some bilateral lifts still within the program. And again, that will become quite an individual component of the program. So we have some players in the squad that are very competent and efficient at performing, for example, bilateral movements. That might be like a bilateral back squat, bilateral deadlift, bilateral RDL, for example, or like a hang clean or one of those sort of variations. And are very competent at moving some load as well within those lifts. Whereas we've got other members of the squad that have a very low training age, so they don't have a lot of exposure to previously lifting within those type of movements, may have poor mobility, poor strength, or just poor sort of buy-in or competency within those lifts. So I find with those type of players, you know, it's a lot easier to maybe get some load and buy-in with some lower, potentially lower load unilateral variations of those exercises. So I think regarding the exercise selection with bilateral versus unilateral, you know, it's a bit of a hot topic, and I know one of the guys that works with us in the academy, Darren Stern, he's doing some good research looking at bilateral versus unilateral training and performance outcomes and injury on the back of that. So you know, it's a real interesting topic for me, but I'd say probably over the years have shifted towards, especially with senior players, more of a unilateral emphasis within the training programs that we sort of deliver. And that sort of ties in with sort of, you know, another terminology we'd use is strength stability. So often in games, players are put into vulnerable positions where they're standing on one leg, or in a sprint or jumping position where they're mainly pushing off one leg and having to land or push off in an unstable sort of position, really. So again, there's a little bit more of a transfer maybe from doing unilateral training into some of those movements or positions they'll end up in a game scenario. And also a big thing in football is obviously it's contact sport and being able to players to use body strength. And this is something maybe we see more in the younger players that are transitioning through into the first team. Have they got the physical capacities, the strength, the upper body strength to be able to deal with the demands of work or playing at a senior level? So again, some of their programs will look different to some of the more sort of experienced senior players in terms of how we continually sort of develop them physically. So again, there might be more emphasis on sort of hypertrophy work with those players as much as sort of performance or strength and power work that we do across the squad. So again, I know it's a bit of a summary there in a nutshell. You spend all day talking about the different types of strength and the force velocity profiling of players. But just some terminologies I just wanted us to be aware with when I show you through some of the program we use. We'll almost refer back to some of these, types of strength and the importance of why we're training them and how we're going to train them within the program. So some of the strength training methods that we will use within our programming. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the key ones that we use. So obviously always a good starting point especially with some of the novice players will be some body weight type movements, some calisthenics. And also these work quite well when players are training away from us. So a good example of this would be during the off-season program. Traditionally, we'll give lads programs to follow, which may have a slight strength or power emphasis, but maybe if players don't have access to the gyms, maybe they're away on holiday, don't have the equipment or facilities they're going to need. So we'll generally give them maybe body weight variations. So whether that's to build capacity, so we'll give high volume body weight exercises, or we can do more sort of explosive preparatory type exercises which just involving body weight, which again is a good place to start. Quite easy for the players to pick up and sort of be able to do away from the training ground. Obviously heavy compound training we tend to use. Again, we're very limited when I talk about the periodization we use across the season, but working at elite men's level, there is limited opportunity to get players lifting heavy, and we'll look at where and when we can do that. How we can use Olympic lifts or derivatives of lifts within our programs. Obviously, a common and really real easy one to apply there is it talks about body weight training. So, how we can incorporate maybe plyometrics within our training to enhance rate of force development or speed when we incorporate that into our speed program. So ballistic or explosive type movements. So again, example here with some med ball type throws and variations of those. Eccentric training. So again, more from an injury prevention point of view, we'll have an emphasis within our training cycles and training weeks on just the eccentrics. So things like Nordics, reverse Nordics, eccentric groin slides, things like that will make up part of our programs. Again, more from an eccentric sort of point of view, it's more about injury prevention. And the same with isometric training as well, and sort of how that fits within our overall training program from an injury prevention point of view. Which flows on to a little bit about training systems and different systems that can be used or that I have used or currently use within our programming. So, for example, our traditional method would be looking at a normal periodization model where we'll work through off-season, in-season, pre-season, in-season, and off-season, and then what sort of training focus we'll have across those different points of the season. So, traditional method would look at sort of general physical preparation during that off-season period. So, can we get some anatomical adaptation? Can we build some capacity? And then that'll build us into a pre-season where we'll go more into specific physical preparation, focusing more on strength and power development, and so trying to get that dynamic correspondence. So what we'll tend to do is we maybe train sort of our pre-season, the way I've tended to do it before, and I quite like the way it works, is that we'll do some heavy strength training in the gym to get that sort of higher load element into the training. And then what we'll tend to do is maybe then bring out some of the lower load, higher velocity work onto the pitch. So that may look like doing some plyometrics, med ball acceleration throws, banded resistance work in pairs. And we're trying to bridge that gap between then the strength work we do in the gym and then tying that into the sort of more dynamic explosive prep work on the pitch, and then building that into maybe some speed development training as well. I found for me that that's generally worked quite well over the years. Other sort of training systems that we've tried and tested, again, more for probably off-season or players that are injured that maybe need to gain some mass. So we've played around with elements of sort of manipulate around with a bit of German volume training just to get some volume really. Maximal strength training, so models out there, things like the Elite FTS 5x5 max strength training. Again, difficult to do in season, but we've used sort of variations of this off season into the pre-season. I know sort of at the moment velocity-based training using something like a push band or transducer can be quite good. We've sort of played around with this more rather than across the squad, but with individual players, young players or players coming back from injury. Again, multifaceted. You can use this sort of methods for max strength training, for power training, as a monitoring tool, as a feedback tool. So it's a real effective way of implementing sort of feedback to the players what they're doing in the gym. We tend to use it mainly when we're looking for sort of explosive strength training and looking at make sure players are sort of working within the speed band. So essentially what we can do using a push band is measure the speed at which, for example, if we were doing a jump squat or something like that, we're measuring the speed at which the player's moving the bar essentially. So what we tend to look for is around 0.8 to 1.2 meters a second. So if you think back to the force velocity curve, sort of that mid-range sort of speed strength component. Other methods that we've tried and tested really, so using a bit of contrast training. So if we're limited for number of sessions within a training week, if we only have 1 or 2 sort of opportunities to get the lads in the gym, again, we've used this a lot pre-season, where we'll maybe do some contrast methods just because it's quite a time efficient way of getting some strength and sort of power work into the lads within the same session. So traditionally what this will look like will be a heavy loaded exercise. So for example, it might be a deadlift or a squat, superset with a similar movement but with a more explosive action. So it might be a back squat supersetted with a box jump or a seated box jump, for example. So what we're doing with the strength exercises, using it as a bit of a central nervous system primer, so a bit of PAP training, a little bit of recovery, and then supersetting with an explosive exercise sort of supersets. And again, that can be work quite well if you have limited time constraints or number of sessions within the week. Or another variation of that, which I haven't used too much myself. A couple of guys I work with are quite big fans of the French contrast training. So similar to the contrast training we use, but it's linking 4 exercises together based on each exercise trains a slightly different area of that force velocity curve, which we previously looked at. And then another quite interesting one at the moment, which again I haven't used loads of myself. We've trialed bits of it with some injured athletes, injured players, looking at sort of triphasic training. So within each exercise, overloading certain elements of that exercise. So we tend to focus on, first of all, overloading the isometric component of an exercise. So for example, if there's a back squat, there'll be a controlled sort of lowering phase, sort of 5-second isometric pause at the bottom, and then an explosive concentric action coming out of that. And then progressing that through to then overloading the eccentric component. So it might be, I use the same exercise as an example, we'll do a very slow eccentric component of the squat, maybe again anywhere between 5 to 8 seconds sort of descent within the squat, a shorter pause at the bottom, and then again a fast concentric. And then the last phase of that will be building in players doing just a fast movement through the whole squat. And again, this can tie in quite well with some of the sort of VBT stuff that we talked about. Again, appreciate that each of these individual systems could be a whole presentation in itself. Just trying to give a little bit of background of some of the systems that we have used or we do currently use. And then another common method we use would be incorporating supersets or trisets within our sessions, purely the fact of a time element and logistic element in the gym. Again, when we talk about programming, some of the key considerations really is, what is the ideal program for the athletes, but does that program fit with the environment and facilities you've got to work in, and how do you make that program best work in that environment? So that's why we tend to work either supersets or trisets, because it just enables us to maximize the use of the space we've got and the time that we might have with the players. So just to give a little example of this, in our gym layout, we've got essentially three racks and then 3 benches, bit of floor space, a track, for example. So what we might have within the groups of 3 or 4 lads working together in small groups, one of the players might be doing an exercise on a rack. So for example, keep going back to a back squat analogy. So for example, doing a squat variation. Another player might be using the bench, doing some sort of like upper body dumbbell press. Another player might be doing something ballistic or plyometric on the track, and then it'll just rotate through. So it works quite well in terms of programming around the actual environment that we're working in, as well as, you know, what is the optimal sort of program for the player. Again, yeah, just a little bit of a background on, so when it comes to programming, I've talked a little bit about sort of benefits, why we do it. We've covered there about some of the different systems that we've currently employed. But essentially, I think whatever you're going to prescribe your athletes or your players, got to come really, like I said, come down to the individual demands or the individual needs of that players. So the first thing, like I said, what we'll do is we'll do an individual needs analysis of every player in the squad. So that'll consist of sort of a medical screening. So we'll have a multidisciplinary input into the players' training program. So we'll have a medical input as well. So this just gives us the opportunity for the physios to highlight any previous injuries the players may have had, any concerns the physios might have about players doing certain types of exercise. So example of that, we've got one player with quite bad sort of spondylolisthesis. So that means that, you know, he has some issues with his spine. Essentially, we can't put any actual loading through that player. So that then takes our exercise prescription for that particular player. So we'll have our medical screening. That'll be the first layer of our assessment. The second layer will be our sort of physical or performance testing. So like I said, that generally consists of a number of tests that we'll do in the gym. So we talked about using something new we've brought in. We've just brought in some force decks. So we've now started progressing our jump testing from a just jump mat onto the force deck. So that's a whole new sort of data collection we've got, and that's really going to help us moving forward in being able to prescribe our gym-based programs for the players. But yeah, some jump testing, which we'll do vertical and horizontal jump testing, bilateral and unilateral. We'll do some strength testing in the gym. So again, we've got various tests that we use. We mainly use a single leg press 3RM for unilateral strength assessment, obviously in conjunction with what we're doing with the jumps. We've currently got a Nord board we use, so we're measuring hamstring strength, both eccentrically and isometrically, and comparative left versus right. And also we have a groin bar which we recently brought in. So main test we're using on that at the moment, looking at adductor versus abductor strength as well. So generally some isolated strength testing there, more from a screening point of view, in line with that performance test. Like I said, looking at some jump testing and the single leg press data that we use. Like I said, we've got away really from using 3RM back squat or 3RM deadlift, which I have used in the past, just because again, number of players in the squad that either can't perform them tests well enough with good form. You know, I think at this level we're working at, you know, we want to get as much information on the players as we can from a testing point of view, but also we don't want to be putting them at risk of injury. You know, if we injure a player in the gym, it's not going to go down too well with a manager. So we have to be a little bit careful and selective with making sure the tests that we administer are generally suitable for the majority of the squad to perform safely and efficiently. And we also do some capacity testing. So that's more of a medical screen that we'll do, generally calves and quad capacity tests, just to identify players at risk of injury from those tests as well. So as well as the testing we'll do, we factor in, obviously, previous injuries, a big one. So if we know players had, you know, significant history of soft tissue injuries or hamstring injuries, for example, we know that then we need to be really honing in on our testing with what we're looking at with the hamstrings. And then possibly if there's a weakness there, then are we putting the right intervention in place, and our program's going to be geared around that. But like I said, another big one we've got to look at is, say, within a squad of 20, 25 players, you know, we might have some players with a training age, gym-based training age of 15, 16 years, so some real competent lifters. And we've got other players maybe with only a training age of 1 or 2 years, if that, and that sort of training age might be very minimal as well in terms of what they've actually done within those 2 years of gym training. So I think within a squad, you know, I've gone very much from back when I first started trying to get everyone back squatting 1.5 times body weight, because that's what the research said was the best thing to do. And being a bit naive and inexperienced at the time, and coming out from university thinking, right, if I can get everyone back squatting 1.5 times body weight, we're flying here. You know, we're not going to have any injuries. We're going to be out jumping everyone, out running everyone, which definitely wasn't the case. So probably a way I've adapted my philosophy over the years now is trying to take a much more individualized approach based on all the factors we've just talked about there. Once we have that level of information, it's then about, like I said, looking at the demands of the sport, demands of the position, and, you know, profiling that player based on where they are within the squad, where they are within their position, and then trying to base their focus of their training program around that. So some players, you know, if they've had a big injury history, their whole focus of their program may be purely around, you know, can we make them more robust? Can we minimize the time missed through injury? Can we improve their availability? And so their whole program may be geared around injury prevention training or injury minimization training, versus other players that may be, you know, we know are really robust. They don't have a lot of injuries. They have a big training age, and we know they can handle a decent amount of load. Their program's going to look very different to maybe some of the other players we've talked about that aren't quite at that level. And then it's about, you know, some of the factors we talked about there. So our training principles that we're going to apply within that. What's our programming in terms of our periodization model going to look like, and how's that differ between individual players? And also, how's that going to factor in, you know, how does the gym work we fit in with the players? How does either that complement or inhibit maybe what they're doing on the pitch? So, for example, I don't think I have a good way of explaining this, but obviously we have a certain training week that we generally implement. That can change from time to time, but we're quite well structured. But for example, if I implement something in the gym with a player or a group of players within that training week that then has a negative impact on what the manager wants to do on the pitch the following day. So, for example, if we have a heavy gym session on a Tuesday and I make all the players really sore and they have to come in and perform high intensity training on a Wednesday and they're not able to perform because they're fatigued or they have DOMs, then what we're doing is actually going to inhibit, you know, what they're able to do on the pitch. So that's another thing we have to factor in with our program, is that, you know, when we do a particular intervention or implement a new exercise or overload the player with what they're doing in the gym, the consequences of that obviously have to be factored in regarding the rest of the training week and what they're going to be expected to do. So obviously that's a key consideration. I've had it a few times this year where we have done that. We've put the lads in the gym on a particular day, and half the squad have come in, you know, really sore and been complaining all the way through training. So again, it doesn't really go down too well with a manager. So it's something you've got to factor in with your training programs, which we'll show you in a minute. And then also, how does that exercise selection fit and the type of programming using fit with the training program, but also the needs of the athlete. And then, like I said there, from a prescription point of view, depending where we are in the season, but generally in season, it's just that minimum dose response. So, you know, what can we get the players to do that's hopefully going to have either a maintenance effect or a development effect, but without, like I said, giving them DOMs, giving them fatigue, where it's then going to inhibit their next training session or performance in a game. So that's always the difficulty and the trade-off, I think, at this level. And again, that's going to come down to so many individual factors. Like I said, we've got one player that probably could go in on a Tuesday and have a real heavy strength session and be fine to train on a Wednesday, whereas another player hasn't got that same sort of load tolerance. You put them through any sort of loading on that day, they're going to come in really, really sore the next day. So that's where it's about knowing your individual players as well and knowing their background and their capabilities, really. And I said, probably the biggest thing for me is really when you're doing your programming is thinking about that training environment. And if you do have a squad of players in one session, how do your programs work and cater for those individual differences within your programs across the squad? And again, that's going to be dictated to by what equipment and what space that you've probably got available. I've had it before where we run a lot of internship schemes, or I've had new members come into the department with, you know, these textbook unbelievable programs where you look at them on paper, you think, wow, that looks amazing. they try and implement it in the environment they've got to work with, and it just doesn't work logistically. So I think always assess your environment before you start putting your programs together. Again, I've probably been tripped up on that one before as well. So yeah, just to touch on some of the constraints and sort of real life situations really we deal with working at sort of this level. So historically, football has a very, very long in-season or competition season phase, generally around 40 weeks. It's probably this year with COVID and everything feels more like 60 weeks. It was sort of 2 seasons have merged into one. So you see during this phase, it's the main bulk of the training year. It can be difficult because not only within that 40-week period do you have about 50 games plus, depending on cups, potentially many midweek games within that as well. So it's not just a case of, you know, every week we have a clear week that we can follow a set sort of model. That can change very, very quickly week on week. That can also change within season based on if games are postponed, if you have a cup run and your game schedule gets sort of altered throughout the season. So generally what I do in terms of my planning is once the fixtures get released at the beginning of the season, I'll obviously put my plan together for the whole season regarding, you know, where do the games fall, where are our windows of opportunity for testing or screening, where do our windows of opportunity come to get some sort of strength development or power development into the squad, where do we have to look at maybe having some recovery for the players. And what I generally look for is in the season, if we have a block of a minimum of 3 weeks. So when the schedule comes out, we might have a 1 week, then a midweek game, then 2 weeks, then a midweek game. But normally within the season, there'll be maybe 3 to 4, maybe maximum 5 occasions where you'll have a 3-week block where you have no midweek games. And that's where I'll generally look to make some S&C implementations or some S&C gains. The rest of the season it is about either trying to maintain or getting the players to recover from games. The other thing you've got to factor in, obviously, within the squad is that you'll probably have 2 to 3 subgroups within the same squad. So you have your first team regular players, I'd say, that pretty much play every game, and that might be 7 or 8 players within your squad. You'll have maybe another 7 or 8 players that are key squad players that are constantly in and out, but they could be at any point. They could get, you know, quite heavily rotated, 1 game in, then a game out, or 2 or 3 games in followed by 2 or 3 games out. And then you've got essentially your third sort of subgroup is your other squad players, which may be your up and coming young developing players, or your fringe players, or your players coming back from injury that are essential part of the squad, but maybe get very minimum game exposure. So what we try and do is almost cater from a gym point of view for those 3 individual groups. But the difficulty is obviously players can move from any of those groups at any time. So it's it can be quite difficult at times trying to track where players are regarding the bigger picture. So like I said, it's quite a complex process of trying to sort of plan a periodization model based on looking at traditional methods that are out there. Obviously, in football, there are lots of different sort of periodization models that have come about over the years, but most of those looking at more pitch-based implementation of training as opposed to gym-based. So for me, it's just taking a logical approach to how you supplement your gym work around the pitch-based sessions. Like I said, I generally look for 3-week periods of where we have a 3-week block to actually get some progressive overload. So what I generally find is if you go 2 to 3 weeks with no sort of stimulus in the gym, normally the first session back, players do seem to struggle with fatigue, soreness, DOMS, etc. So for me, it's pointless if you've only got 1 week window between games, trying to then implement S&C because we're just making the players sore. But when we have those 3-week cycles, it enables us to build it back in a little bit more progressively and minimise that fatigue. So it's just, again, a consideration. As we know, through the season, we have generally a relatively short off-season. So generally, the season will finish around the beginning of May, and then the players will be back in for pre-season sort of beginning of June. Within that time frame, what we're looking for is enabling players to recover mentally and physically from demands of the season, but also to try and prepare them then for the demands of what's coming in the pre-season and in-season period. So Generally, we'll give the players maybe 2 to 3 weeks total rest and recovery, and then it'll be a 3 to 4 week off-season program they'll get given to work remotely. And again, generally the consensus of this is more about sort of reintroduction to training, progressive overload, but we'll have sort of higher volume, so higher repetitions, higher number of sets, but generally lower to moderate load. So we're getting those sort of anatomical adaptations, hypertrophic sort of effects of the training program. Again, that will vary based on individual needs and requirements, as we discussed. But that's generally the theme we'll work off, as well as introducing some sort of aerobic and conditioning work to do alongside that as well. Obviously, the pre-season is quite a key time for us to actually sort of develop the players from a specific physical preparation point of view. So this is when we'll start focusing more on individual needs, but more of an emphasis on strength and power development and getting that transfer onto what they're doing on a training pitch. So I said, how does that then build into some of the sort of speed and agility type conditioning we're doing on the pitch? And again, just because this is being supplemented in with quite high volume of pitch conditioning work, generally we tend to keep the volume to a moderate level. So again, it'll be less volume than what they do in the off season, a little bit more volume than what they'll do in the in-season sort of phase, because we're trying to still obviously overload and develop the players to an extent. Yeah, so once we get into the season, it's all about looking for those windows of opportunity, and then sort of building that in progressively when we can. And generally that's done through reduced volume of training. So whether that's reduced number of sets or reduced number of reps or just less exercises, again, that's going to be fairly individualized. But like I said, it's finding that balance of getting enough stimulus to maintain probably what we've built up in the off season and pre-season, but without creating too much residual fatigue alongside that, or sort of central nervous system fatigue. So again, yeah, it might just be about sort of microdosing. I think for me, the key is from my experience is that the more consistent you can apply some sort of load, the less sort of DOMS and fatigue you'll get when you start then trying to increase that load. So again, what we'll tend to do is in season, if we've got a group of players, like I said, it might be we've got a group of non-starters that haven't played a game. We might microdose them after a game with some eccentric loads, something on a flywheel, something on a K-box, just to get some stimulus into them. More difficult, probably the group of players that are playing week in, week out. For them, the focus is going to be more about recovery, but it's just looking in them other two groups that maybe are in and out the squad or not in the squad too much, looking for windows of opportunity to apply stimulus to those guys to keep developing them physically, especially, as I said, with those younger, more developing players that are coming through. That's quite key. So these are just some example weeks of how we implement that if we have a clear week. So we've got a couple of different training models that we sort of play around with, more from the manager's discretion than ours, to be honest. But one method that we have is we'll if we play on a Saturday, we'll have Sunday off. We'll be in on a Monday and Tuesday. We'll have Wednesday off. We'll train Thursday and Friday to play again Saturday. So based on this model, what we tend to do is with the whole squad, even the lads that have played, we generally do like an upper body session on a Monday. And again, that might be more about strength or power, or again, for some of the younger players or players that need a bit of bulk, that might be more geared around some sort of hypertrophic work. Tuesday, again, will be more of an individualized lower body strength or injury prevention and injury prevention session. So I'll give some examples of programs that we use on a Tuesday. This is when we'll generally have our highest load day from a gym point of view. We'll have Wednesday as a recovery day. So that enables them, allows them to sort of recover and adapt from the session that we've done on a Tuesday. And then Thursday, on a Tuesday, we'll generally do the session post-training. Wednesday will be a recovery day. On a Thursday, then we'll tend to do more of a explosive power-based session, like I said, whether that's in the gym or if the weather's quite nice, we might take that out and do some pitch-based sort of power work as well at the beginning of the training session or as part of the warm-up from the training session. Friday, we tend to not do any sort of S&C work because we allow the players to prepare for the game that's coming on the Saturday. And then, like I said, on a match day after the game, we might do some sort of, I call it an injury prevention or robustness circuit after the game, and we'll show you what that looks like in a minute, with a rest day on the Sunday. Another variation of that is sometimes if we have a clear week, the manager might give the players a Sunday and Monday off, which then all we do on a Tuesday is we'll merge the upper body from the Monday with the lower body session on a Tuesday. So a little bit of a bigger session, but a bit more sort of combining the 2 days together. We'll have Wednesday still the same, and then Thursday and Friday, Saturday will still look the same. So potentially all we're doing, if the manager just decides, look, you know, in a heavy period, we're going to give the players 2 days off, we'll essentially just mix those 2 sessions together. And another method which we've sort of gone more towards this season, not that we've had that many sort of clear training weeks, is that we'll have the Sunday off. We'll train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday will be our recovery or off day for the players. And when we sort of switched this model, this is when we started having a few issues with players doing a strength session on a Tuesday, coming in on a Wednesday to train and being a little bit sore, fatigued from that session. So I didn't actually use this model very much until the current manager came in and employed this, what he'd used at previous clubs. What we tended to do on the Monday would be, rather than having 3 days in the gym back to back, we'd stay out the gym Monday. It might be just more of a recovery day, so some mobility, some yoga type work. We'd do a bit of a hybrid strength session on the Tuesday, which would be a bit of a combination of a total body, uppers and lowers. But what we ended up having to do is resorting to stripping that right back in terms of the volume. So rather than having a normal Tuesday volume, we probably reduced it by about 40%. So we'd probably go from maybe, you know, if we were doing 4 or 5 lower body exercises previously, we'd maybe strip that down to 2 or 3, and potentially reducing the number of reps as well. So maybe just bringing it down to 3 sets of 3, 3 sets of 4, as opposed to maybe 3 sets of 6 previously. So it was just trying to minimize that amount of load, so they were then able to come in and train at the intensity they needed to on a Wednesday. And then what we'd tend to do, similarly, we'd do a little bit of power work on a Wednesday, again, maybe reduce the volume. And then some of the exercises which we would have done traditionally on the Tuesday, so for example, Nordics might have been in on a Tuesday session, we might then move that onto the Wednesday post-training when they had the recovery day on the Thursday. And then essentially the Friday and Saturday would look similar. So again, it just highlights the fact that depending on whatever training model that your club uses or the philosophy of your club, that you have to adapt your programming around that. You know, at first when we changed models, I tried to be a little bit sort of resistant and keep our strength work how it was, but it tended to cause some issues and I said a bit of fatigue. So, you know, we had to change the way that we did things. So just some examples of some of the sessions that we would traditionally use. So as I said, if it was a total body session, if we were off on a Monday and we were then going to come in on a Tuesday and do a total body in the gym, then this would look different for different players. So this is just a bit of a generic example of a group session that we'd use. So it may look, we would do the triceps, which we talked about, again, just work quite well in terms of logistics. So we tend to do a lower body lift, an upper body lift, and then a core accessory exercise or a trunk accessory exercise. Again, depending where we are in the season. So if that was a pre-season, that may be 4 sets of 6. If it was in season, it may end up being 2 sets of 3 as a sort of maintenance dose. With the upper body and core, generally the volume's not as much of an issue. We can sort of generally keep the sets or the reps where we would sort of during pre-season. We're not going to create as much fatigue as we are with a lower body. So that first set would be sort of trap bar deadlift into a pull-up. Again, I know probably from a programming point of view, looking at that, you say, well, maybe, you know, from a forearm or grip strength point of view, is there issues there? Go from heavy deadlift into another sort of pulling exercise. Again, we just programmed it because it worked like that with the layout of the gym. So we'd have one player using a trap bar on the track, another player using the rack to do pull-ups, and then another player just on a mat, bit of floor space doing a core. So again, it's as much logistical with the exercise selection and the way they're sort of grouped together as it is from a science point of view. Then we'd generally have like a unilateral exercise, which in this instance would be Bulgarian split squat. So again, big fan of either split squat variations, whether that's Bulgarian, riff, elevated, lunge variations, reverse or forward lunge variations, just again for that unilateral strength development. Again here, just from again logistic point of view, weighted push-ups. Again, as a variation to doing a bench press or a dumbbell press, and then some kneeling rollouts from a trunk point of view, and then posterior chain, so single leg RDL. Again, the volume is going to be dictated to where we are in the season, just with some accessory upper body and rotational core there. So just trying to pick. So if you look for the exercises, we've got heavy bilateral, got hip dominant deadlift, then a unilateral sort of lower body dominant split squat, and then a unilateral posterior chain. For the upper body, we've got a pull up there, so a vertical pull, horizontal push, and then a sort of bit of a hybrid curl to press exercise there. And then from a core point of view, just some trunk control work there, trunk stabilization with the electors and the rollouts, and then sort of a rotational sort of core exercise in there. If we're just focusing on sort of lower body strength, so again, we might have more exercises in, just focusing on lower body, but this would be more based if this was a Tuesday strength session with a Wednesday recovery day. So we said we've got 6 exercises in there, so probably quite heavily demanding from a lower body point of view. And this would maybe just be more like a off-season, pre-season lower body strength session. If us to carry us on in the season, like I said, we'd either drop the sets or drop it down to just 3 or 4 exercises within that session. So again, trap bar deadlift, Bulgarian split squat, single leg RDLs, and then more just for an injury prevention point of view, we've got our Nordics and reverse Nordics there. And then just to change the plane of movement, so some lateral lunges, again, common injuries in football, groins. So just implementing some eccentric groin work in there as well. So less exercise in total, but more emphasis on overloading the lower body. Example power session we've got here. So some variations I like to use: trap bar jumps. Again, traditionally have used variations of Olympic lifts, whether that's some mid-thigh pulls, rack pulls, high pulls variations. But I've just found from a learning point of view and a complexity point of view, players are pretty competent at picking up a bar and jumping, and we get some reasonable load on there with good form. So from a time point of view, they're a good one for me. And prefer, again, just from an actual loading point of view, using a trap bar as opposed to using a loaded sort of back squat or jump squat, really, just for that spinal sort of shock. Into an upper body sort of push, dynamic push there. Again, we've used the push band for some of these exercises before. Like I said, mid-thigh pulls we use for the players that are competent in those lift. An upper body pull, again, just a dynamic pull. And then some split jumps as well. Again, we talked about that unilateral training. So from a unilateral sort of explosive strength point of view, an explosive med ball chest throw, and then again, just to change the plane of movement for our transverse plane, just some lateral and rotational sort of explosive movements in there as well. So that would look like sort of a total body power session. Again, probably more from a pre-season point of view. Again, in season, we'd either drop the volume, so it might only be, half of that within a session, or it might only be 2 sets of each exercise. And then another variation of that is more of a contrast. So I know we talked about contrast training, where we do heavy sort of strength exercise with a power X superset. So again, just looking at similar movements grouped together. So hex bar deadlift would be a good example with a seated box jump. Then what we'd try and do is we'd do a block of those. So it might be 3 sets of 3 to 5 reps of each of those exercise. And then just to allow a little bit of neural recovery from the lower body, our next block then would be an upper body variation. So again, it might be like a heavy bench into like a med ball chest throw, back to a lower body. So it'd be, again, unilateral emphasis now with a split squat into a split jump, looking at sort of movements that mirror or are similar. And then back to an upper body. So it might be, again, pull up into a superset with a medicine ball slam or something like that. And then last variation, just to give some examples. So again, we talked about players that have had maybe significant injury history, or maybe not have as much of a training age or as much competency in the gym to do some of the more advanced or the heavier lifts that we talked about. So they may end up on a program that looks, instead of the strength session that I showed you, may look something like this, more body weighted, bit easier for the players to learn in terms of technique. And what we're looking for here is just building robustness, tissue tolerance, etc. Things we sort of talked about at the beginning. So we may have like an eccentric hamstring with a Nordic, an eccentric quad there, reverse Nordics, some sort of Copenhagen for some groin, some isometric groin strength. Again, a lot of research around the Copenhagens and injury prevention. Some isometric hamstring exercises, some sort of calf raises there, body weight calf raises. And then again, good one for players maybe with shoulder injuries or our goalkeepers, for example, just doing some prone shoulder taps just for a bit of sort of core and shoulder stability. So that may look like something we'd do after a game as well. So like I said, if we've got a group of squad players that haven't played on a match day, we may do like a circuit, 2 sets of a circuit, something like that, just to get some load. You know, if we're at an away game, we don't have much facilities or equipment with us. It's easy just to get the players to do some sort of like body weight injury prevention circuit. I think this is the last example. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of all the programs that we give the players. You know, like I said, we do take more of an individualized approach. These are just some of the sort of more generic type squad sessions that we do use occasionally or that we've used in the past. And again, bit of a contrast. So got your sort of contrast type session there. I appreciate probably gone on a little bit longer than planned with the presentation. So just to sort of summarize it really, I think from our point of view, how we work it and my sort of key take home messages would be predominantly, you know, firstly, your program's got to be geared around your individual athlete considerations. So based on all the things we talked about, you know, their training age, injury history, previous training experience, training needs, training goals, based on the testing you've done. It's got to be focused on much individually as possible. Again, your constraints are going to come around your environmental or the facilities you've got to work with. So, you know, it's not possible for us to have in our gym 25 players all doing their own totally individual programs. So what we might have is we might split the group into 2 groups of 12, for example. One group might be coming in and doing a bit more of a generic strength or power session, and then the second group, maybe the group of individual athletes coming in to do their own programs individually and separately. How does your gym-based training program sort of fit in around the pitch-based conditioning and the work they're doing with the coaches and the management? Again, like I said, it's got to complement it. You know, we've got to be careful as S&C coaches that we don't actually, like I said, overload the players too much in the gym where that inhibits them what they're doing on the pitch. So for me, our work we do in the gym is secondary to what they've got to do on the pitch. So that always has to be the primary focus. Other thing is, you know, the key one, especially if you're going into like a new club or your new member of staff, is understanding what the player or the squad buy-in is to the gym S&C work. And if it's not great, it's, you know, how do you get that level of buy-in through either building relationships with a squad or individual key members in that squad, or how do you get buy-in through actually getting the players to enjoy the programs you're setting them? So, you know, it's not always just about doing the textbook program, and it's sometimes, you know, we've got certain players that hate lifting heavy weights, but I know if I gave them some sort of med ball circuit or, you know, ballistic circuit, they're really going to enjoy it and thrive off it. So again, it's something that, you know, trying to fit in with what we want them to do, something that they're also going to be motivated to do as well. So that's sort of blending the art and the science there. Like I said, consistency is key. So trying to get regular minimum dose sort of exposure to the players, I think is key, just to minimize when you do restart a block of sort of strength training or start overloading the players a little bit more, that they're still sort of conditioned to those movements and tolerating a bit of load. And I think there as well, I think the key thing as well for me working with footballers, maybe different with, you know, individual athletes, sprinters, you know, the program's going to look a little bit different, and sometimes simple is the most effective way. So I think key thing is just do the basics well, get the players, you know, in the gym first of all, get them enjoying what they're doing, and give them things that they can actually perform quite well and again able to sort of progressively load over time really. So I appreciate trying to fit in a lot of information into a relatively short period there, so hopefully it wasn't cramming in too much. Like I said, I think it's just understanding with your programming, especially with footballers, is, you know, the bigger picture and how what you're doing is going to fit in around everything else they're doing and making it as individualized as you can, really. But I think, Marco, from my point of view, I'll leave it there from a presentation point of view. If you have any questions, now's probably a good time.
Thank you very much, Laurence. So I really enjoy your presentation, and you explain a lot of things, honestly, because you chatted about a lot of things. So one of the things that for me was very interesting was, for example, how you change a bit your philosophy from, say, more traditional resistance-based training with the Olympic lift at the beginning, and after you have seen that sometimes player can struggle to obviously perform with a good technique these type of exercises, and maybe at the beginning you had some test also with this exercise, and after you change that, and this is exactly what I found personally in the past. So this one is absolutely a good point.
Yeah, I think it's very common then, because for me personally, and I know a lot of students in particular come out from university, with all this theoretical knowledge and things they've learned, which is great, and go and do the UKCA accreditation and come out, and it's almost like you've got all this information and all this knowledge that you've learned, and you just want to like whack it all into this process and think, this is the way forward, and this is going to work for everyone. And probably what I've realised in the real world that there's 100 different ways to skin a cat, and you've got to make it as tailored to each individual as possible. And for some players, fantastic, they will enjoy that type of program and they've got the background to be able to do that. For other players, they've got no interest to do that, they haven't got the motivation, they haven't got the training age or experience, they haven't got the strength levels to probably do some of those movements with any real intent. But I think for me, that biggest part of my personal development is just understanding individual players a lot better. Whether that's through watching them, whether that's through talking to them, whether that's through, just spending a bit more time with them and understanding their views and philosophies. So I think that's the biggest thing for me. It's just probably a lot more from sort of like generic sort of programming to more individualized approach.
No, absolutely not. I agree with you. The second point that was very interesting for me, for example, was about your periodization. Obviously, you propose 3 different programs, and honestly, the first one is the one that I enjoy, I could say, the most, with the first day with the upper body exercises. After you have a match days -4 with for example, lower body strength training, injury prevention, and the match days -2 with the power. Because I like the idea to give to player that have played 2 stimuli during the week. One that is more obviously strength training, one that is maybe a micro dose of power training. But I like the idea to have the double session with strength training and power training. I know 100%, like you say, that sometimes you struggle to find time, but if you have, for example, a period, like you say, a small windows of time, that can be, I could say, in my opinion at least, the best way for perform strength training. But I know that frequently the player have so many commitments that they cannot have this free time for the double session.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's why generally on a Tuesday when we're further away from a game, I think the players sort of quite comfortable to train and then come into the gym and do some reasonable lifting post-training. And then I found on a Thursday when we tried to do a similar thing post-training, like there was a bit more sort of reluctance for the players to come in. I think players' perception of gym is whatever session they're doing, it's always in their heads, it's always going to create the same amount of fatigue. So if you say to a player, we got gym today, well, that's going to make me sore. They don't even know before even knowing what they're going to do in the gym. I think it's over becoming a little bit of a mental barrier. So I think what we started doing and then is building it into the pre-training program. So it might only be a 15-minute pre-activation session in the gym. And we started off purely just like body weight, doing some like jumps, some landings, some box jumps, some med ball throws. And then what we was able to do over time, players were like, oh, actually, don't feel sore off this. I feel quite good going out to train. Then just progressively adding in some different exercises. So like you said, it might be throwing in some hex bar jumps that are slightly loaded. So I think it's just getting that buy-in from the players that like not everything you do in the gym is going to have the same outcome, and it's not going to give you the same element of fatigue. So I think once they can sort of understand that they can go in and do that on a Thursday and not feel fatigued or stiff or sore on a Saturday, then I think you can get the buy-in that way. So I've tended to now do my power sessions pre-training as opposed to post-training.
No, thank you very much. This is honestly a very good feedback, because obviously in practice many practitioners maybe struggle to periodize a bit of strength training, and sometimes we have the coaches or sometimes also the player that maybe they don't have a strength conditioning background, that they don't understand 100% the motivation of some exercises or some choices. And exactly on this point, I would like to ask you, because you have changed a lot of managers in your career, and you have a lot of experience. How much, I could say, the manager periodization philosophy and anyway training philosophy can influence your strength training periodization?
Yeah, I think it's huge. And for me, it's having that relationship with the coaches to be able to sort of them to understand what you're trying to achieve within the work the players are doing in the gym. And then for us to understand predominantly what the coaches are trying to achieve and what their sessions are going to actually look like within their training cycle across the week. And obviously different managers do have different ways of training. So some managers tend to have a lot longer sessions, whereas other managers might be shorter but more intensive sessions. Some managers might be somewhere in between. So we've had it before, in particular, where we may have planned like a heavy strength session on a Tuesday afternoon, and then for whatever reason the manager in that particular morning has done a 2.5 hour intensive football session. The players then report for the gym, absolutely shattered. So then it's a case of if we then just throw our program at them as well, we're just going to kill them. So we have to then be clever in terms of really quickly thinking on our feet and saying, well, actually, we'll take the lower body exercises out and we'll just do the upper body. Or sometimes just saying to players, right, just pick 2 lower body exercises that you want to do, or that you feel that you can perform today without sort of being too fatigued. Or so I think sometimes giving the players like a bit of not an option to do it or not to do it, but giving if you've got 5 exercises that you want them to do, saying, oh, actually, okay, I get that you're fatigued today, you had a bigger session, pick 2 or 3 of the exercises that you would prefer to do. I find some ways players can become resilient straight away and be like, no, I'm not doing it, I'm fatigued, I've had a hard session this morning. Straight away by saying, oh, look, okay, I understand that. I'm sure you can manage to do a little bit. What if you had to pick 3 of those exercises out of those 5 or 6, just pick 3, and they're like, all right, okay, I'll do that sort of thing. So I think it's about trying to get the players on board by showing that you're reactive to what's going on around you. But also I think, and back to your initial question, is probably trying to have a good enough relationship with the coaches that your program mirrors or fits in harmony with what they're doing on the training pitch, which sometimes is easier to do than other times. But I think it's just trying to find that balance. And normally, if anyone's going to have to adapt what they're doing or suffer, it will be us, not the coaches, not the other way around. I said, unless we kill them on a Tuesday and then they've got to train on a Wednesday. So we've been in that scenario as well.
No, thank you. Brilliant, brilliant. So the last question after I think we can conclude, and this one is more a personal question, because I obviously I live in the UK for a long period now, but I come from another country. So I would like to ask you, have you never had a manager that, for example, or a head coach that didn't like honestly strength training, and maybe this manager would prefer to do everything on the pitch? I mean, obviously, you can do strength in some way also on the pitch during acceleration, deceleration, some type of sport-specific exercise, but you never had the opportunity. You never have the opportunity to replicate exactly what you do in the gym. But have you had a manager that was more, say, very pitch-based than gym-based? They didn't like maybe have the player into the gym?
Yeah, I think, like I said, probably I'd have to count up exactly how many different managers I've worked with over the last 15, but definitely more managers than years. So I'm probably going to be in the 20s, mid-20s in terms of number of head coaches or managers, or maybe low 20s. But I went through a spell, particularly when I had a 5-year spell at Charlton, and after the first 2 years, we had a change in management, And then over that next 3-year period, probably had 10 different managers in a 2-year period. So a real high turnaround. It seemed like every 3 or 4 months there was like a change in head coach or manager. And that was probably the only time where I've worked with a few different coaches that were skeptical about players being in the gym or what they were doing, but never said like, no, you can't do it. I've never had a manager say like, no, it's banned. I know other practitioners in the game quite well that have been in that scenario. But it's one then, they're not keen on it, so they're may look for excuses. So if they've said, look, they don't like the gym, and then the player gets injured on a Saturday, it'd be, well, because blaming what they've done in the gym on a Tuesday, for example. So you can end up being in a difficult situation in that sense. So I think it's trying to find, again, a happy medium, between working relationship with that coach and trying to achieve from a S&C or physical conditioning point of view what you feel needs to be done, and sort of trying to get your philosophy or point across to that manager or that head coach. I think that's the skill in that scenario.
Perfect. Thank you, Laurence, for all your information and for. Sorry, there is a bit of return probably. Thank you very much for your time and all your explanation and the presentation. I think you gave a lot of tips, suggestions, and very good examples to practitioners, students, and all the people that are listening and watching this presentation. So I will really thank you for your time.
No problem. You're welcome.